Alright, welcome back, chess fans, to part 2 of the series on chess imbalances. Today, we're going to look at the center. The center is important because that's where all of the pieces effectively have to move through. The center is going to determine much about a position, even whether there's lots of pawns there or no pawns there, or pawns that more or less one side controls versus the other. These are all factors and they all have to do with the center directly. I think we can all imagine quite easily how bishops on a board with no pawns on the center files would have great ease to really strafe and be quite effective. Whereas on the other hand, if pawns were just blocking up everything and nothing was really moving anywhere, bishops might have a little bit more of a tough time being effective in this kind of position. So like I say, it really does determine quite a bit. So often when we hear the center referred to as being these four squares, actually what we're talking about more is that d5 and e5 would be white's central squares, and d4 and e4 would be black's central squares. Okay, and I think that the best way to really just understand what we're saying here is just a matter of space and center control. As we see, when we get into these positions where we're only allowed to move up into the 3rd or 6th rank, what ends up happening is that we can see it's just so easy to get our pieces trapped in, and even if we wanted to move out a piece, it's like well, what then, where then, and again, black has no problems activating anything at all. Development is completely natural and normal, and it's white that has to really struggle. And in this kind of a case, really, I mean, if you want to call it center or space, again, it's almost the one and the same. You see how it all kind of blends together as imbalances do. It's just not what you want to do. You really want to take your center, and right now white does not have control of his center. Black, on the other hand, does have well control of his center, you see. And so again, when we're talking about it in these kinds of terms, we can see that while yes, okay, all four squares are central squares, we should really be looking at it like d5, e5 are whites, and d4 and e4 are blacks. All right, and this is going to really, I think, let us get the most out of what we view the center, how it works in terms of relation to space. But the center really relates to a lot of things. The center relates to, as we were saying, bishops. It relates to knights. It relates to rooks and all the rest. All right, so let's look at some of these ideas. Here we can see we have a bishop in the middle of the board, and we have a bishop on the edge. We can see that the influence of the bishop in the middle touches 13 squares. The bishop on the side of the board only touches 7. Further, the squares that the bishop in the middle does touch are all central squares. If you look, this bishop really only touches 1 in the extended center, whereas this bishop touches 3 in the extended center and 1 in the immediate center. So it's a lot more critical than this bishop here on the edge in many variations. See? So this is another reason where we gain an understanding of the center just being so important. If you don't allow your opponent to put pieces there, his pieces by default will have less influence, and less influence will mean less power. Here, same thing. In fact, we call this the octopus knight, where it's just outposted nice in the middle of the board. And you can see here, when here on the edge, it's really not so good at all. It's really only got 4 squares to influence, 2 of which probably won't even be a factor in the game at all. It's, really got minor influence. So once again, if all things equal, and I really want to underline and underscore and highlight that when I say if all things equal, that's what I mean. I'm saying if there's no other imbalances to consider, which is never true, there always are, but assuming there's no other imbalances or anything else to think about or anything else to evaluate, then yes, if we had a plan that could force our opponent's knight to the edge, we would go ahead and effect that plan. If we had a plan that could outpost our knight in the middle permanently, then we would go ahead with that plan. And that's a powerful idea if you can manage to, get a permanent outpost in the middle, particularly where there's no pawns to harass it. That can be a good thing, and or white bishops to knock it off. And these are just kind of things that we consider. How permanent will that knight be there? What's its staying power? Can it be displaced by a move that white was going to make anyway, or is white going to have great difficulties dealing with the presence and influence and power of a central knight outposted permanently? It's a little bit different with the rooks. With the rooks, every rook, anywhere you put a rook on the board, all right, 14 squares of influence. It doesn't matter where you put that rook, 14 squares of influence. If it's in the corner, 14 squares of influence. If it's in the middle, 14 squares of influence. So we don't really talk then about rooks in terms of how many squares they can influence. We talk about them in other terms. Terms such as open files. Terms such as can I aim them at power players like queens or kings, and so on. We'll touch on that a little more momentarily. In this position, we can see where pawns actually achieved a strong objective of taking the center. Again, we see where space and center are tied. Again, this is because we're typically talking about pawns. Pieces in this area are often displaced by pawns. So to have pieces on the central square isn't necessarily what we're talking about when we say controlling the center. Okay, we're talking about pawns, and the mechanics of this are clear. In this position, if at any time black would like to undermine this monster pawn center bully, he's effectively going to have to sacrifice one of his pieces and hope that he can get 2 pawns for a piece. Alright? Aside from that, he's got to let it stay and let it stand. We see that these pawns can't move simply because we're going to just play d5 and f5, and then the show's over for sure, because we'll have central rollers that are just going to roll up the board with tempo and displace everything that they touch and then roll in for the queen. So this is done and more done. And it's not to say that white didn't pay the dues. White paid the dues. Okay, so that pawn center there actually cost white a knight on move 4. Alright? And that's good to know, because that's, how the game kind of moves. Alright, we're trading things for things and arguing which is worth more. In this case, white says, give me a strong center and I will give you my knight, but you'll have to throw in a loose king as well. Black says, I think I can work with that. Deal. Okay? So that's a good example again of what we're talking about when we say controlling the center, taking the center, pay attention to the center, and everything else. It's just one consideration of many, 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 but it is a consideration nonetheless. In this instance, we see the center once again, a chief feature of this position. In many chess games, it's going to be the D or the E pawn of either side, or both, that actually ends up getting taken off first. So this is typically where we hear the advice of, in an opening you want to take the center, develop your pieces, castle your king, and bring your rooks to the center of the board. That's because the center of the board is where the play typically is going to be in many openings. Again, certainly not in all. So certainly we don't take anything as law. We just ask, is that a consideration in this position? In this particular position, I'd posit that it is. When you look at the difficulties that black is going to have bringing rooks to the middle, it's actually kind of a big deal. Alright? If black wants to put those rooks on the middle, he's got to move his knight out, castle, move his rook to the middle, that's 3 moves, move a pawn 4 moves, move a bishop 5 moves, move the knight out 6 moves, move the rook to the d8 or 7 moves for black to go ahead and put his rooks on the appropriate squares. White needs 1 move castle, 2 move rook to e1, 3 moves rook to d1, and white's completely finished. So this means that white's going to be able to really get his rooks in there first and impress power first. And as it is with rooks, often whoever gets there first wins. The easiest way to contest a file is to get there first. So that's a big thing, and it's good to know these kinds of things. If we don't really appreciate what a rook does on a semi-open file, and the kinds of problems that can create in your enemy's camp, we might miss that move, and we might do something else that we feel should be done here. And it's not to say there isn't. Maybe there's a tactical shot here or whatever, but it's just to say that it is a chief feature of the position in pretty much every variation. Okay, so that's something that white's going to look at in terms of, again, controlling the center like that. This is so tempting to get into a discussion of pawn structure, but we're going to have to shelf that for a minute and circle back around.